"Two options only," he said, "and your friend chose option two. He gave you up so that you could be healed. Extraordinary, really." Hello, and thank you for listening to the English edition of the English Vietnamese bilingual podcast. Three notes, three quotes. Ba câu, ba điều. In each episode, I will introduce you to a book through three quotes and three things from it that I find memorable. Stay with me until the end of the podcast to find out why I chose the opening quote of today's episode, as well as why you should give this book a try. Do you often encounter ironies in life? They do not have to be something very significant. Often they are just things that go against instinct and common sense. The most common example is probably when riding a bicycle. The slower you go, the more difficult it is to balance, which is why it is so difficult to practice cycling at first. We are afraid of falling, so we don't dare to push for momentum. We don't dare to pedal very fast. We instinctively think that it will be safer if we ride slowly, but in fact, when the bicycle is stationary, it will fall to the side, and it's only when we pedal fast enough can we balance on it. Kate DiCamilo's The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane is a book with a lot of ironies in it, and not all of the ironies in the book are as trivial as cycling. Before opening the book, I think everyone should take a deep breath and not let the calmness of the first few chapters lull you into a false sense that this is just an ordinary children's book. Perhaps this is the first irony of the book, because often we think of the experience of a healing story as something cozy and sweet, but if there were no pain, there would be no need for healing in the first place. And just like the irony of the thunderstorm of youth, under which you are willing to get drenched once more despite the cold, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane is a book that I am willing to reread, even if my heart is once again broken into 21 pieces. If you've taken a deep breath, let's get to the first thing I want to say about this book. There is one theme that author Kate DiCamillo brought up several times in the book, each time in a different way, and that's the irony of listening and speaking. If you ever had a raging argument in your life, you will easily recognize that we instinctively turn up our voices when arguing, because we want the other person to hear clearly what we're about to say. But the irony is that if the other party also argues back loudly, then no one is listening and nothing gets heard. Even if the other person is silent, you still may not have achieved your goal of getting that person to listen to you. There are people in the world who deal with raging arguments by silently closing the door and leaving, both literally and figuratively, both in external actions and internal thoughts. But it is not only in arguments does the irony of hearing and speaking exist. In normal situations, we can also cut off our opportunity to listen by asking questions in the wrong place at the wrong time. The question might give you an instant response, but an instant response is usually not the answer you truly need. Considering yourself in the same situation, would you tell your full story to someone just because that person questioned you? In the book, Edward Tulane is a toy rabbit made of porcelain, and it's obvious that he can't ask questions or talk over anybody. And yet, in the early days of his life, he didn't know how to listen, even though he was completely silent. It was only when he drifted into the kitchen of Nellie and her husband, and was given a new name, Susanna, that Edward understood. And what he understood was that when we really listen, the one speaking can sense the difference, and only when we believe we are truly heard Do we want to share our stories? I suppose you think I'm daft, talking to a toy, but it seems to me that you are listening, Susanna. If the irony of hearing and speaking is something we understand, accept, and practice, even if we might forget when we are in a rush or acting on impulse, the next irony that Kate DeCamillo mentions in the book is something that each of us understands deep down, but finds it very difficult to accept and often deliberately ignores. And that is the suppression of emotions, as well as the denial of emotional needs, do not represent a strong and resilient character. From childhood to adulthood, multiple times in life, when we express anger, hurt, annoyance, or pain, we receive repression and denial. Gradually, instead of calmly confronting and figuring out the source of these unpleasant emotions to resolve and prevent them from happening again, we swallow these emotions and put on the image that we are fine on the outside, so that we don't have to listen to ridicule and dismissiveness again. But if we don't know how to deal with our own emotions, when others share their feelings with us, we won't know how to deal with them either. And the irony is, we would then likely react by throwing out the ridicules and dismissiveness that we once didn't want to hear the most. In the book, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, Edward the Porcelain Rabbit spent 7 years with a hobo named Bull and his dog Lucy. In these 7 years, Edward became the listening ear as well as emotional support of many other wanderers. Each of these people carried with them a story, while leaving behind their families, their friends, their loved ones, and people they had lost. But not everyone dared to face their feelings and open their hearts until they met Bull and Edward, the Porcelain Rabbit. Edward listened, but he couldn't speak, which made him the best option for a wanderer to share his feelings and hurts. But the image of an adult picking up and confiding in a toy rabbit will most certainly receive contempt, insults, and ridicules. However, Bull was someone who understood the value of a companion, of having emotional support, of expressing emotions instead of letting emotions accumulate to the point of bursting or eroding one's character. The strength of Bull's personality does not present as a superficial disregard of emotions, but as a steadfast protection of the emotional needs and emotional expression of others. Bull quietly but persistently defended Edward's presence at the hobo's campfires, and this assurance not only protected Edward but also safeguarded a space for other wanderers to express their feelings. At first, the other thought that Edward was a great good joke. When Bull sat with Edward carefully balanced on his knee, one of them called out, "Got yourself a little dolly, Bull?" Edward, of course, felt a surge of anger at being referred to as a dolly, but Bull never got angry. He simply sat with Edward on his knee and said nothing. Soon the man became accustomed to Edward, and word of his existence spread. So it was that when Bull and Lucy stepped up to a campfire in another town, another state, another place entirely, the men knew Edward and were glad to see him. If you listened up to this point, you're probably wondering what the next irony is, and what it has to do with today's opening quote. But this is probably not an irony, but the answer of the author to the question, if ironies are inevitable in life, then what kind of decisions can we make when facing them? There is really no gentle way to ease into this answer, so I will just lay it out straight. Decide on the option that produces the right outcomes instead of attempting to satisfy all the parties involved. This might sound a little cold-hearted at first, especially when we are surrounded daily by calls to compromise, negotiate, sympathize, give in, and balance. However, when we only focus on finding a solution that satisfies all parties and also sits well with ourselves, we forget the main goal needed to be achieved, or the main problem needed to be solved. Every desire comes with a cost, so there is no solution when no one has to bear at least part of the price. In the book, such a decision was made by Bryce, who rescued Edward and brought him back to give his sister a friend during the last days of her life. But a porcelain rabbit, while bringing comfort and joy, could not be a miracle cure for a child in sickness. After she passed away, Bryce and Edward became each other's only support, until Edward was shattered. Through his sister's death, Bryce understood what it felt like to lose someone forever by trying to keep them by his side, even if both sides never wanted to be apart. He understood that sometimes the person we loved needed a love that was beyond our means, and so he chose to say goodbye to Edward after the porcelain rabbit is restored by the doll repairer. I told him then that he had two options, only two. The first option being that he seek assistance elsewhere. Option two was that I would fix you to the very best of my considerable abilities, and then you would become mine, his no longer, but mine. Here Lucius fell silent. He nodded, agreeing with himself. Two options only, he said. And your friend chose option two. He gave you up so that you could be healed. Extraordinary, really. I'm going to close this podcast episode with one last irony before seeing you in the next episode. We often think we read a book because of its main content, but is that really the case? If you're still here listening until this moment, let's think in silence together for a short while. If simply knowing the main content is enough, just go online to read the AI compiled summary and you're done. But afterwards, do you feel like you want to remember it, or do you just feel they are empty words? The three things I talked about, as well as the three quotes above, are not the main content of the book at all, but they are the things I remember and make me want to open the book and relive the experience. Right at this moment, are you being reminded of any other books and want to reread them? The one thing that just popped up in your mind, is it really the main content of the book? If you already read this book, what is your favorite quote from the book? If you haven't, did any of the things I talked about earlier remind you of any other books you know? No one can read all the books in the world on their own, so don't be afraid to share the books you love with others. At least do tell me. I'm always here waiting.